Thank you so much, Rasika, for this generous invitation. It's really an honor and a privilege to be speaking in this series with such august company of speakers. So let me straight away start with my talk, and I hope that we would get more time to interact and discuss later. So as Rasika read out the title, let me just reiterate it once more. No culture but culture. Preliminary notes towards a materialist dialectical concept of culture. Now I could might as well title it also as I'm only making notes, the way the film is titled, I'm only making a report. Anyway, so from the first part of the title of my talk, No Culture But Culture, it would be sufficiently clear that I'm not anxious to rescue some abstract universality from the clutches of cultural particularism. Rather, the title clearly suggests that I'm not only sympathetic to the name culture, but also wish to think with it. Yet, I think a clarification would help to avoid a possible confusion about what I mean by no culture but culture, what I'm saying no to and what I'm affirming. Otherwise, some may spontaneously interpret that I'm saying no to a culture that violently imposes homogeneity, while affirming a culture that tolerates, respects, celebrates diversity. Or some others may wishfully think that I'm saying no to hegemonic, canonical, elite, high culture, while affirming counter-hegemonic, quotidian, subaltern, popular culture. Let me clarify at the outset that I'm not saying no culture but culture in either of these senses. I do not think either of these divides take us very far or help us raise the conceptual stakes of the name culture. Because both these divides, despite being animated by apparent tension, tend to operate and circulate within the dominant consensus of our times, which French philosopher Alain Badiou calls democratic materialism. And Badiou interrupts this consensus with an orientation of thinking, which he names materialist dialectics. Now, it would be sufficiently clear that I'm situating the dividing line between democratic materialist consensus on culture and materialist dialectical concept of culture, the one I propose to outline in the second part of my title. Before I proceed with the outline, let me briefly unpack both these terms, democratic materialism and materialist dialectics. By democratic materialism, Badiou refers to the contemporary consensus that there are only bodies and languages, that the world consists exclusively of bodies, material entities, both animate and inanimate, and of languages, the symbolic systems and cultural practices that structure bodies and organize their relationships in various contingent ways. It regards human being as animal with opinions, located in a finite mortal body that is conditioned by various linguistic systems and cultural practices. The coexistence of multiple symbolic systems is promoted by democratic materialism as an expression of its belief in their relative value and general equivalence. Of course, the only cultures that are not tolerated are those that are themselves deemed intolerant, because they regard their beliefs and practices as absolute. Democratic materialism rejects all transcendentalism and relegates spiritual and religious beliefs to the realm of local beliefs and practices, where they are honored as long as they do not challenge the principle of universal equivalence or interfere with the free circulation of material goods and symbolic capital. Democratic materialism is deeply suspicious of uses of the word truth, where it means anything other than logical consistency, representational correspondence, or scientific exactitude. Any other sense of truth is dismissed as a totalitarian attempt to dominate and hierarchize the fundamental equality of opinions. Democratic materialism encourages thinking only insofar as it operates within the limits of thinkability or statistical probability. It equates thinking with knowing, where knowing amounts to analysis, which is to ask what are the structural conditions of the current situation, or prediction, which is to ask in what direction will the current situation likely develop, and critique, which is to ask what are the contradictions underlying the current situation. Since democratic materialism recognizes the general equivalence of money form as the only permissible universality which alone makes one world possible, everything else needs to be rigorously culturalized, contextualized, historicized, relativized, and can only be equalized through democracy of opinions. Within democratic materialism, there are competing yet complementary positions on the implications of finitude. So on the one hand, it is argued that since bodies operate within realistic constraints imposed by finitude, that not only determines what can be, what can happen, but also dictates what must be, then it becomes our obligation to respect what there is, basically capitalism and nature, or naturalized capitalism, and thereby cure ourselves of communist utopias of the past century, which were noble yet destructive. On the other hand, it is argued that finitude has infinite resources of unlimited expansion of technological innovation, of an ever possible betterment of democracy, of an endless negotiation with natural environment, and technological revolutions, deepening of democracy, and deep ecology would provide us with infinite progressive soil for our incurable finitude to flourish. Thus, be it a culture violently imposing homogeneity or a culture respecting diversity, neither can afford to entirely block free circulation of commodities and finance, even if they choose to modulate these flows differently, either by erecting anti-immigrant walls and building detention centers, or by welcoming outsiders and encouraging inclusivity. Similarly, be it an elite or a counterculture, neither can escape mystical allure of commodity form, nor numerical imperatives of algorithms generated by eyeballs and footfalls. In fact, democratic materialism thrives upon these antagonistic dualities between liberal democratic and totalitarian regimes, the civilized West and Islamist fundamentalism, and so on. Following Hegel, Badiou argues that by dialectic, we are to understand that the essence of all dualities is the third term that marks the gap between the other two. He counters the sovereign duality of democratic materialism, which is bodies and languages, by introducing a third term, truths. The democratic materialist consensus, there are only bodies and languages, is interrupted by materialist dialectics, whose summary statement is, there are only bodies and languages, except that there are truths. Though materialist dialectic agrees that there is nothing more than bodies and languages, it affirms that sometimes there are exceptions which fall out of the material relationships of bodies and languages and fundamentally transform them. Truths do not constitute some third type of thing, a spiritual or metaphysical entity, but are fully immanent to the world and composed of nothing more than bodies and languages. This does not mean, however, that truths are merely local, contingent, or transient, but are at once concrete and universal, situated and absolute, finite and infinite, historical and eternal. Yet affirming truths do not require us to submit to any theological orientation which rescues truths only at the price of an absolute transcendence of the one, by submitting finite multiplicities of bodies and languages under the formal authority of the one infinity, often called God. Following mathematician George Cantor's footsteps, Badiou uncouples infinity from the one by positing that all that is can only be in the form of a multiple of multiples without one. So there is no one truth that subassumes and totalizes multiplicity of truths. Detaching all forms of the multiple from the one, Badiou de-absolutizes the one, but without sacrificing absoluteness of truths for a relativism, either linguistic or cultural. Taking his cue from another mathematician, Paul Cohen, Badiou names truths as generic multiples, which contingently emerge in a concrete situation, but do not belong to that situation alone. Their utter novelty is neither discernible by encyclopedic knowledge of that situation, nor exhaustible by juridical limits of any situation. The contingent emergence of truths decomplete or incomplete any existing world, interrupts its enclosed finitude by opening it to a construction of another world in that very world. Truths, according to Badiou, are processes or procedures that establish and expand infinite consequences of new generic multiples, which are groupings of elements not organized according to any shared objective predicates, but merely by their subjective orientation around a common void. Human beings may decide to participate in such truth procedures, which are local instantiations of universal, infinite, and eternal truths. And in doing so, they participate in construction of subject bodies in excess of their corporeal and linguistic individuality. Truths are not part of the democracy of opinion concerning the essential animality of human life and the relativity of languages. And they cannot be adjudicated by the standards of representational correspondence, statistical probability, or majority rule. Participation in truth process is a thought practice, which is not reducible either to an analysis or a prediction or a critique of the world as it is, because it is a laborious point-by-point creation of a new possibility, previously unthinkable according to the governing logic of the world, by maintaining subjective fidelity to the contingent truth event. According to Badiou, truths emerge in 4 different domains: art, science, politics, and love, where novel construction of previously unthinkable possibilities take place. Badiou considers art, science, politics, and love as 4 distinct truth procedures or truth processes. Their distinctness is defined by the kinds of truths they produce. Art produces sensual or sensible truths through invention of novel forms and affective thinking, which can solely be experienced by senses. Science produces conceptual truths, which needs to be rationally demonstrated either by argumentation, deductive proofs, or experimentation. Politics produces collective truths concerning collective ownership of justice, whose consequences need to be tested on the terrain of history by constructing an organization without enclosure into identitarian brackets defined in ethnic, racial, religious, linguistic, or cultural terms, or submission to the imperatives of state power. Love produces existential truths, where the sexual difference, irreducible to gender or biological difference, is creatively sustained to construct a world from the vantage point of the two, from the vantage point of this difference itself, while maintaining indifference towards graded social hierarchies and antagonisms. The subject bodies actualizing each of these processes are also materially distinct. A series or configuration of finite artworks and not individual artists compose the subject body of artistic truth process. For example, Greek tragedy, atonal music, cubism, whereas axioms, theorems, proofs bearing the proper names of scientists form the subject bodies of scientific truth processes. For example, Cantor and modern set theory, Zermelo-Frankel set theory, Paul Cohen and the continuum hypothesis. Political truth process is organized in the form of a collective subject bearing a proper name that divides the political field. For example, proletariat, Dalit, Dalit Buddhist. While love subjectivizes individual sexuated bodies into two. Concerning these truth processes, Badiou has three distinct concerns which have direct bearing on the name culture and its possible conceptualizations. First, given the democratic materialist propensity to relativize and culturalize truths, Badiou fiercely maintains irreducibility of any of these truth processes to cultures, which appropriates truths, encloses their universality into identitarian brackets, and neutralizes their exceptional novelty into everyday habits. Exceptionality of truths is folded back into culture's own exceptionalism, where truths become exclusive possession of those cultures. Thus, for Badiou, the name culture comes to obliterate that of art. It inveighs against every generic concept of art, putting the concept of culture in its place, conceived as culture of the group, as the subjective or representative glue for the group's existence, a culture that addresses only itself and remains potentially non-universalizable. Moreover, it does not hesitate to posit that this culture's constitutive elements are only fully comprehensible on the condition that one belongs to the subset in question. Yet, Badiou's anxiety is not limited to culturalization of art, but culturalization of any truth process as such. Thus, he firmly asserts that politics itself is acultural, as is all thought and all truth. Now let's come to the second concern. Badiou is also concerned with maintaining autonomy of each of these truth processes. He considers conflation of any two truth processes or subordination of one truth process to another to be a recipe for disaster. Yet, he is equally aware that formally these truth processes could be separated, their autonomy could be established, but in their actual historical unfolding, they invariably intersect, intersperse with each other, infect each other, and thus cannot remain independent of each other. This awareness of historical intersection of these truth processes leads Badiou to his next concern. In his interview with Bruno Bustils, Badiou vocalizes this third concern and admits that one must conceive of a theory of the network of truth processes, and for which one must come back to the question of culture. One must return to the question of culture. He admits that his earlier dismissal of culture essentially was polemical in nature. In order to establish universality of truths, he did not want to take culturalist approach. Otherwise, what he wanted to establish against the contemporary consensus would have completely gotten lost. Yet in the same interview, he admits that when it comes to the question of grasping the actual historical unfolding of truth processes, one cannot maintain a doctrine of the absolute purity of these truth processes in relation to each other. One needs to know what exactly is a crossing or a linkage between these truth processes. He explicitly proposes that one needs to construct a theory of the networking or the tying together of truth processes, and immediately adds that he sees no reason why this networking or tying together of truth processes could not be called culture. provided that one completely reconstructs a formalized concept of culture. I provisionally name this formalized concept of culture, which is to be reconstructed, as materialist dialectical concept of culture. This concept of culture needs to provide a theoretical account of binding or knotting of truth processes as they historically unfold, without lapsing into contextualism or historicism. This concept needs to reflect upon complexities, tensions involved in the process of the entanglement of truth processes. How culture provides a subjective glue to the knotting of the truth processes while retaining their autonomy. How culture creates a new vigilance to maintain deterritorial openness without letting truth processes descend into an enclosed identitarian geocultural totalities, or without letting them dissipate into everyday habits either. Such a materialist dialectical concept of culture could provide us an account of historical inseparateness of truth processes. Before we turn our discussion towards formal aspects of this concept, let us briefly survey productive tensions animating the relationship between these truth processes. Specifically, the complex entanglement between three pairs: art and politics, science and politics, and love and politics. While Badiou affirms that art and politics are autonomous truth processes, each having their own internal events, rhythms, and historicities, so none of them can claim relation of authority over the other, yet he maintains that whenever artistic creation is subordinated to political imperatives, the so-called political imperatives are actually statist imperatives. Badiou sees no possible mediation between a political event and artistic creation than what he calls contemporaneity. While reflecting upon French filmmaker Jean-Luc Godard's work after the event of May 1968, Badiou observes, except during the extreme radical period in his career, Godard did not subject his art to any political imperatives. Rather, he tried to work in such a way that his films would be interventions whose contemporaneity could easily be seen. Badiou takes example of Godard's pre-68 film, La Chinoise, and argues that in no way it is a Maoist film or a film about Maoism. In this respect, it is very ambiguous. And the Maoists were very unhappy about it. La Chinoise is simply a film that has the guts to say that it is contemporary with the establishment of Maoism. All Godard does is ask himself, what does my art make of this contemporaneity? Yet such contemporaneity between political event and artistic creation is not a general law. Acknowledging contemporaneous overlaps between Meyerhold's and Brecht's theater works and the October Revolution, Badiou also notes that the French Revolution gave almost nothing to the theater, except for a German romantic play, Danton's Death, by Büchner. Badiou also reminds us that the height of theater in France between Richelieu and Louis XIV was coextensive with the construction of absolutism, which eliminated virtually all free politics. Badiou accepts that politics has given an essential material to theater, yet that for him does not necessarily make theater into a political act. He accepts that Corneille, Aristophanes, Brecht, and Sartre have made visible the play of political decisions, but he also maintains that in doing so, they do not create a particular genre called political theater. For him, genres in all the arts fall within the purview of form. Thus, he believes in the case of theater, one can speak of comedy, of tragedy, of epic theater, of romantic drama, of vaudeville, of naturalist or symbolist theater, even theater without theater, because all of this sheds light upon artistic choices. But he maintains that he does not quite understand what a political theater might be, even if his own theatrical output may appear to fall within this category. For Badiou, theater seizes human figure in its generic and complete dimension, including political, but without reducing to it. Badiou recognizes that art can indirectly prepare a subjective ground for politics. And because art plays a major role in shaping subjectivity and has powerful unconscious effect, its distinct effect on the general structure of desire, Badiou argues that the post-revolutionary states especially place art under close surveillance or use it as an instrument of propaganda. In this strategy, Badiou recognizes parallels with the ancient Platonic move to place art under surveillance so that at least its formidable subjective efficacy may be at the service of truths. Badiou names this move didactic and argues that when it comes to the thinking of art, Marxism, like Platonism, has been didactic. He considers Bertolt Brecht to be a practitioner of Stalinized Platonism. He considers that Brecht believed that art produces no truth, but is instead an elucidation based on the supposition of the true exists of the conditions for a courage of truth. Art elucidates the conditions for a courage of truth. Art under surveillance for Brecht is a therapy against cowardice. Not against cowardice in general, but against cowardice in the face of truth. And thus Galileo is a central figure in Brecht's theater. Yet Badiou recognizes that Brecht's unbridled creative thought could not remain content like Plato with classifying the existing arts as either good or bad. Instead, Brecht obstinately searched for the immanent rules of didactic art through his artistic invention of non-Aristotelian, meaning non-classical and ultimately Platonic theater, which reactivated Plato's anti-theatrical measures into a novel theatrical form. Despite Brecht's creative invention, Badiou maintains that during the course of the 20th century, this didacticism, that is skepticism of art's incapacity to produce truth, thus its subordination to external truth, was saturated by the state-bound and historical exercise of art in the service of people. To emphasize art's capacity to produce truth, Badiou proposes a new schema, which he names inaesthetics, which maintains that not only is art capable of producing truths, these truths are singular to artistic process and cannot be produced elsewhere. Yet, asserting the singularity and irreducibility of art to politics does not stop Badiou from naming that cinema is a mass art which produces paradoxical relationship between two categories. Mass, a fundamental political category, a pure democratic element in terms of eruption and eventual energy, and art, an aristocratic category in terms of individual education and differential registers of taste. Aristocracy of anyone. Even in his 15th thesis on contemporary art, Badiou argues that the only maxim of contemporary art is to not be imperial. This also means do not be democratic, if democracy implies conformity with the imperial idea of political liberty. For Badiou, this non-imperial art is necessarily abstract art. It is not concerned with any particular public or audience. This non-imperial abstract art is related to a kind of aristocratic proletarian ethic. It does what it says without distinguishing between kinds of people. In fact, Badiou believes that today art can only be made from the starting point of that which, as far as empire is concerned, does not exist. Through its abstraction, art renders this inexistence visible. That is what governs the formal principle of every art, the effort to render visible to everyone that which for empire, and so by extension for everyone, though from a different point of view, does not exist. Badiou alerts us that since empire is sure of its ability to control the entire domain of the visible and the audible via the laws governing commercial circulation and democratic communication, it no longer censors anything, reminding us that all art and all thought is ruined when we accept this permission to consume, to communicate, and to enjoy. Badiou provokes us to become the pitiless censors of ourselves, because he maintains that it is better to do nothing than to contribute to the invention of formal ways of rendering visible that which empire already recognizes as existent. Now let's look at the other pair, science and politics. Though Badiou warns us that conflation of politics and science may lead to dogmatic economism, whether Marxist or neoliberal, yet he does not shy away from displacing a well-known scientific category of hypothesis into the political field to coin a hybrid term, the communist hypothesis. He asks, what exactly do we mean by failure when we refer to a historical sequence that experimented with one or another form of the communist hypothesis in 20th century? Was it a complete failure? By which he means, does it require us to abandon the hypothesis itself or to renounce the whole problem of emancipation? Or was it merely a relative failure? Was it a failure because of the form it took or the path it explored? Was it a failure that simply proves that it was not the right way to resolve the initial problem? What kind of failure was it? Soon he clarifies the logic underlying this displacement of the term hypothesis into political field. He reminds us that a scientific problem, until such time as it is resolved, takes the form of a hypothesis. Taking a famous example of Fermat's theorem, Badiou reminds us that countless attempts were made to prove this, from Fermat, who formulated the hypothesis, to Wiles, the English mathematician, who really did prove it a few years ago. He draws our attention to the fact that many of those attempts became the starting point for mathematical developments of great import, even though they did not succeed in solving the problem itself. The conclusion he seeks to draw from this comparison and displacement is that failure is nothing more than the history of the proof of the hypothesis, provided that the hypothesis is not abandoned. For Badiou, the decisive issue is the need to cling to the historical hypothesis of a world that has been freed from the law of profit and private interest. Even while we are at the level of intellectual representation still prisoners of the conviction that we cannot do away with it, that this is the way of the world and that no politics of emancipation is possible. Through what he calls the communist hypothesis, Badiou seeks to assert that the existing world is not necessary than it is to say, when we have nothing to go on, that a different world is possible. How in political terms can we move from non-necessity in political terms to possibility? Because quite simply, if we accept the inevitability of the unbridled capitalist economy and the parliamentary politics that supports it, then we simply cannot see the other possibilities that are inherent in the situation in which we find ourselves. Through this displacement, Badiou seeks to argue that failure of an emancipatory political project does not signify its end. The failure neither invalidates the hypothesis nor is a sufficient reason to abandon it. This displacement and the possible intersection between science and politics reminds us that the new philosophy of number elaborated by Badiou in his Number and Numbers is conceived not as a purely mathematical or purely philosophical exercise, but a political antidote to the cold calculation that Marx and Engels ascribed to capitalism in the manifesto. Also, as an aside, Soumyavrata Chaudhary in his Ambedkar and Other Immortals reminds us that B.R. Ambedkar's declaration the value of man is axiomatic, self-evident, similarly displaces mathematical notion of axiom to assert universal egalitarian human worth as axiomatic, which is to say that it needs no further demonstration or empirical evidence. Chaudhary reminds us that even while carrying out the most excruciating concrete analysis of real historical situations, Ambedkar decides on the egalitarian axiom to separate those subjects who will follow it as a universal principle of politics from those who do not. Chaudhary asserts that this separation is both methodological and political, or rather this methodological choice is as much Ambedkar's political choice. We cannot say that Ambedkar follows the principle or axioms of the French Revolution or the European Enlightenment or whatever, because it makes no sense to name an axiom culturally. In other words, the scientific notion of axiom, when displaced in the political field, resists culturalization, contextualization, or historicization of political truths. On the other hand, Badiou makes us equally aware that political thinking is completely different from scientific thinking. For instance, in physics, the experiment is an artificial construction which must be repeatable. In mathematics, there is a guarantee of rational demonstration by proof. Whereas a political situation is always singular, it is never repeated. If politics declares an irreducible and unrepeatable possibility, then science writes down a necessity and constructs apparatus for a repetition. Thus, in the absence of repeatable conditions, either demonstrative or experimental, in politics, argues Badiou, it becomes imperative to rally others around the thinking, to persuade them, for which an organization becomes necessary, in which one can discuss the assessment of unrepeatable experience and attempt to obtain the subjective agreement of those with whom one is organized. Despite this crucial difference in these two forms of thinking, scientific and political, Badiou maintains that if there is a genuine international today, it is really that of mathematicians. They no doubt speak English, as everybody does, among themselves, but above all, they speak mathematics. As in fact, we all should be able to speak communist politics someday, even if in English. Like Plato, Badiou too maintains that if we do not wish politics to remain forever condemned to seductive rhetoric and mere opinions devoid of substance, then one should aspire to displace the mathematical method of rational demonstration into political discussion. For Badiou, the most valuable thing about mathematics is its simplicity, the fact that it is unambiguous, with nothing hidden or obscure about it, with no double meanings or deliberate deception. For Badiou, mathematics' indifference to dominant opinions makes it a perfect example of freedom. And thus he urges us that in order to attain comparable simplicity and universality in politics, one should accept mathematics as an ideal of life. Now I'll turn towards the last pair of truth processes, and then I'll conclude. Love and politics, Badiou reminds us of the crucial difference between these two truth processes. That politics centers on the collective in order to test out the truth of what the collective is capable of achieving. For example, it asks, can it embrace equality? Can the collective integrate what is heterogeneous? Can the collective accept that there is only one world? Things like that. For Badiou, the essence of politics can be subsumed in a single question. What are individuals capable of when they meet, organize, think, and take decisions collectively? While love for Badiou is about two people being able to handle difference and make it creative, yet he points towards a structural parallel between the two processes. Just as the family exists at the level of love to socialize its impact, at the level of politics, the power of the state exists to repress its enthusiasms. So if one plays with the word state, one could define the family as the state of love. Similarly, if the aim of politics is to discover what the collective is capable of and not merely the pursuit of state power itself, then in love, the aim is to experience the world from the point of view of difference, point by point, and not simply to ensure the reproduction of the species. Despite these parallels, Badiou also cautions us not to mix up love and politics. In Badiou's opinion, the politics of love is a meaningless expression, because he thinks that when you begin to say love one another, that can lead to a kind of ethics, but not to any kind of politics, principally because there are people in politics one does not love. That's undeniable. Nobody can expect us to love them. Whereas in love, the absolute difference does exist between two individuals, yet an encounter, a declaration, and fidelity can transform that into creative existence. But nothing of that sort can happen in politics in terms of the basic contradictions, because the central issue in politics is the question of enemy. And Badiou reminds us what Marx said: only political difference with the enemy are irreconcilable. While there is no equivalent to this in the process of love, for Badiou, the problem politics confronts is the control of hatred, not of love. In other words, in politics, where enemies do exist, one role of the organization, among many, is to control, indeed to destroy the consequences of hatred. Yet for Badiou, that does not mean one must preach love in politics. But according to him, a major intellectual challenge politics faces in our times is to provide the most limited, precise definition possible of the political enemy, and not, as was the case throughout almost the whole of last century, the vaguest, most far-reaching definition imaginable. If the enemy is constitutive of the essence of politics, and if genuine politics identifies its real enemy, then in love, the rival remains absolutely external and is not part of the definition of love. In fact, Badiou firmly believes that the difficulties love harbors do not stem from the existence of an enemy who has been identified. In love, if at all there is an enemy, then that enemy is not external, but internal to the process of the creative play of difference. For Badiou, selfishness and not rival is love's enemy. My love's main enemy, the one I must defeat, is not the other, it is myself. The myself that prefers identity to difference, that prefers to impose its world against the world reconstructed through the filter of difference. Yet despite this crucial difference between love and politics, Badiou maintains that since love, like any other truth process, is essentially disinterested, its value resides in itself alone and goes beyond the immediate interests of the two individuals involved. So according to Badiou, even if the meaning of the word communism does not immediately relate to love, nonetheless, the word brings with it new possibilities for love. Since communism is the idea of a world that is not given over to the avarice of private property, a world of free association and equality, in such a framework, it will be easier to reinvent love than in the world saturated by capitalist frenzy. Since by communist politics, one believes that what is held in common prevail over selfishness, the collective achievement over private self-interest, then one can also say that love is communist. Since the real subject of a love is the becoming of the couple and not the mere satisfaction of the individuals that are its component parts, Badiou offers us a new definition of love: minimal communism. Because despite the crucial difference between them, Badiou firmly believes that there is a secret resonance between love and politics. It's a secret resonance between the intensity life acquires when one is 100% committed to a particular idea, and the qualitatively distinct intensity generated by the struggle with difference in love. For Badiou, love and politics are like two musical instruments that are completely different in tone and volume, but which mysteriously converge when unified by a great musician in the same work. Would it be appropriate to build upon this analogy to say that the materialist dialectical concept of culture we are proposing is nothing but that great musician who allows the mysterious convergence between various truth processes to converge? This survey the survey of the productive tensions, complex entanglements, and secret resonance between the four truth processes, finally takes us to the formal aspects of the materialist dialectical concept of culture. As Badiou himself suggests that there are formal antecedents to this concept. For Badiou, Kant's harmony of faculties, Foucault's episteme, Deleuze and Guattari's assemblage and disjunctive synthesis are already pointing towards the formalization of materialist dialectical concept of culture. As suggested by Colin Wright, the concept of artistic configuration in Badiou and the topological figure of Borromean knot in Lacan can also be productively mobilized towards developing this new concept of culture. Drawing upon Badiou's work, Colin Wright himself has formulated the concept of evental culture as braiding of truth processes while demonstrating this concept through the Rasta Reggae configuration. One could observe more formal clues towards developing this concept in Badiou's own work. For instance, philosophy as impure constellation conditioned by various truth processes. The parallel between philosophy as that which composes the relationship between contemporaneous truth processes while producing a new concept of truth adequate to its own times, and cinema, which he defines as +1 art that composes relationship between other arts. Badiou's own life as militant political activist, mathematician, novelist, and dramatist, and passionate lover provides an important existential resource to formalize this concept. Similarly, in our collective readings of B.R. Ambedkar, inspired by Shaumivrata Chaudhary's book Ambedkar and Other Immortals, some of us of Prabuddha Collective are realizing that Ambedkar's decision to convert, to exit the Hindu fold and to reinvent Buddhism as Navayana already anticipates a necessity to construct a materialist dialectical concept of culture, which would organize associated life of those moving away from Hinduism and capitalism on the one hand, and ceaselessly, anonymously moving towards a proper name, Navayana. How to organize the collective duration of this ceaseless conversion without inventing a new culture that ties these truth processes, that engages with the productive tension between these processes without totalizing them, without enclosing them into identitarian territorial brackets. Inspired by the intensity of this question, now I'm finally jotting down some primary notes towards what a materialist dialectical concept of culture can be. They are simple statements. A materialist dialectical concept of culture is that which affirms that there are only bodies and languages except there are truths, thus at once affirming the universality as well as multiplicity of truths. Materialist dialectical concept of culture is that which cannot be simply contrasted against nature and that which cannot be equated with history defined as continuum either, but that which imparts subjective duration and body to historicity, that is the novelty rupture inaugurated by truths. Materialist dialectical concept of culture is that which is rare and not ubiquitous, yet singular universal configuration of truths, that is newness in history existing in relationship with each other. Materialist dialectical concept of culture is that which organizes the relationship between truth processes in a non-hierarchical manner while keeping them separate yet entangled. It is that which composes and sustains the dialectical tension between new and old, what Badiou calls neoclassical synthesis, between infinite and finite, incorporating finite bodies into the construction of infinite truth process, between situatedness and deterritoriality. It is that which educates by truths, transmitting desire for truth, what Badiou calls Socratic corruption. That which cultivates ethics of truths, what he calls subjective fidelity, as well as disinterested interest towards power and money. It is that which gives consistency which resist dispersal of truths into everyday lives and habits. It gives consistency to the singular confluence of truth processes while also resisting identitarian enclosure of truths into exceptionalist geocultural brackets. It is that which, being shaped by eventual emergence as well as historical saturation of truth processes, which is disintegration of its effectivity in history. Yet, despite this saturation and failure, it is that which continues to energize subjective fidelity towards specific truth processes, as well as love for truth as such, which is nothing else but philosophy. So, yeah,